こんにちは、伊藤浄一です。今日のゲストはYatSiuです。Yat は web3 ですごく有名になっているアントレプレナーと投資家で、彼の会社 Animoca Brands はこの2期世界で一番 web3 NFT の投資をしている会社なので、本当に第一人者なんですけども。Hi, Yat. Thanks for being on our show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks for coming to the New Context Conference. I think you're saying you were on stage 15 years ago, and so as a co-traveler from Web1, I think it's a lot of fun to see how the world has changed. But maybe we can start out just to get to know you a little bit, and can you describe what Animoca Brands does and what kinds of projects you're working on?
Sure. Animoca Brands started in the whole sort of, I guess, what's now called Web3 space. Almost 5 years ago now, actually in 2017, first with CryptoKitties. And when we saw the opportunity of what non-fungible tokens could do in what is now known as the open metaverse, delivering true digital property rights, we went all in that space. So that's when we made investments in OpenSea. We actually brought in the Sandbox, Dapper Labs, Wax, Decentraland. And today we have over 340 investments in the space, really trying to construct this new shared network effect that we really believe in. And actually also reforming the internet, which we thought kind of went wrong, right? From being very decentralized in Web 1 and then becoming very centralized in Web 2. And we think Web 3 basically will open that up.
And I remember I was working with you very early on Animoca when it was going wrong, when Apple basically kicked us off of the network, right?
Correct. So actually in 2011, we were one of the biggest mobile game companies. And we had figured out that if we launch an app every week, we would always be at the top of the App Store. So you could argue that we gamed the system, but frankly, in a traditional capitalist democratic environment, you work to your advantage. Apple didn't call us and said, hey, we don't like this business practice of yours. They just removed us. In 2012, in early 2012, they literally just hit the delete button. All of our apps were gone. We had 160 people at the time whose future was entirely like, what's going on now? But more importantly, we had millions of customers who had lost access to their favorite games and applications and were like, of course, blaming us for it. But I think what was also really tragic is that we were censored, not because they obviously removed us. And to this day, I have no idea who that is. Actually, I remember I called you up, hey, who do you know at Apple that can help me? And I remember, I think when we spoke, you're like, oh, this looks bad, because the guys at Apple are like, these are like really bad guys, and they're like, criminals and everything. We're like, you haven't even spoken to us, right? There's no judge, no judiciary. But because we were so desirous and actually needed to get back to Apple, we self-censored. We couldn't tell anyone what was going on. And through that, ended up basically becoming even more guilty in the eyes of our customers, even though we were victims. And I think this is the issue here, right? Yeah. Which is the problem about Web 2.
Yeah, I wonder, did that experience motivate you a little bit more? Because I remember when you were getting into NFTs, I was like, but no one uses it, but it's free.
Well, absolutely. I mean, things that shape you in the past absolutely sort of bring that forward. And I think with the very first instance where we got excited about NFTs wasn't really drawing back to the whole sort of centralized structure. That came very quickly. It was this idea that I could own my digital identity. And I bought my first virtual item, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, in a multi-user dungeon in the mud. And I paid, I think it was like $20 for this virtual sword, which was like a lot of money back then. I had to wait 2 weeks for delivery because the check would have to be sent, they'd have to cash it in, right? And then we would meet in this sort of, shoddy bar inside the game, and then we'd literally swap. I mean, it was hugely inefficient, but there was already this desire to do so. And of course, with World of Warcraft, you had gold farming and everything. So inherently, people already sort of felt that there was a need to own our assets in the online world. So that was the initial attraction. But then very quickly, when we started to learn the power of decentralization and blockchain, that basically became the vision. And we coined this term, content is the platform, as a way to release and free content from centralized platforms.
And Animoca, back in the early days, I think Animoca, I guess I was on your board, so we would make our own games.
That's right.
And how did you go from there to being one of the largest investors in the ecosystem?
So we do both, right? Half of what we do is we build our own businesses, like Sandbox, for instance, which is most well known, but also Phantom Galaxies and Rev Racing and so on. And then the other half, we invest in the space in things that we think will help grow the ecosystem in what we describe as a shared network effect. and also help onboard customers. Now, why do we think this way? One of the things that happened in the Web2 world is that when Facebook built itself up, it wanted to open, a transparent open platform where people could construct on. Sounded fairly noble, and perhaps the intentions were. But when they started gathering all this data through the API accessing, they came to realize that actually I have a monopoly of information, and I don't want to lose that monopoly. Also, I don't want to share it, and more importantly, I can now benefit from it greatly. And so what happens is a classic case, where in this famous quote, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's exactly what happened. And this is not just true for Facebook. It's true for every central organization that becomes a monopoly. So what we wanted to make sure is that we construct ourselves in a manner where half of our business is building our own stuff, but the other half is invested in an open ecosystem such that if we make a choice that we were going to become monopolistic in our practice, we would lose something. Imagine if Facebook was actually an investor in Zynga, or somehow had a stake in the success of all of the businesses that built on Facebook. I think many of the decisions would change because they realize that even if there's a moral argument to be made, we needed to make sure that we were economically tied in the same way. And in its nature, Web3 is inherently anti-monopolistic because of the open framework. So it meant also that if we're going to build a business, it doesn't make sense to build it as a monopoly, and also doesn't speak to our values. So we decided that we're going to kickstart the ecosystem together. That's why we made seed investments in the likes of OpenSea and Axie Infinity.
Because it's pretty different than normal VC, where normal VC picks one to become the monopoly and they push away everything else.
It's a classic zero-sum game. And I actually think this is the problem what we see in the world today. VC capital is no longer thinking themselves as how does it benefit the ecosystem. Some do, but most VCs look at just profit. But profit as its purpose becomes a negative in and of itself, because what happens is that you're trying to extract as much value as possible at the expense of others, when in fact you're looking to build a joint ecosystem. When you look at countries that have a reasonably strong justice and social system, you can still grow and everyone can profit, but you grow so in a manner that is sustainable. And you live in countries and places, I live in Hong Kong, right? And uber capitalism in Hong Kong has created, frankly, a tear in society, right? Where the whole purpose of capital and money has been sort of almost perverted, where only a small number of people can profit from it at the expense of others, which is of course not what people set out to do. It just created that circumstance. So we actually think Web3 is also a way in which we can reform our views on capitalism. Because capitalism is the reason we have innovation, is the reason we have growth, is the reason why democracies function. But now that it's become exclusive, we're dangerously close to moving to a world where it's oligarchies and new kind of kingdoms that are being constructed. So I think this is a way in which we think capitalism can come back to its purpose. Now, when you think of the VCs, people give them money for the purpose to make to make more money, and so they're looking for the zero-sum outcome. And because they're funding in this manner, they're actually hurting everyone else. I think that's a mistake, right?
But you have shareholders, and you are the biggest investor, so you are in the traditional capitalist system, and you're pretty powerful, right? So you may not have a monopoly, but you're kind of like the local warlord, right? So because in a way, when I look at web, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, but I'm just curious how you think about this, because I think that because there are fewer governance tools like the shareholders agreement for venture, you probably need to have assurance that the entrepreneur takes care of you, right? And that being the largest investor operating is probably part of that assurance. So it's sort of only half tongue-in-cheek, the warlord thing, right? Because people care what you think now.
Yes. So I think there's a few ways. First, when you invest in one of these companies in Web3, you don't just invest in the equity, which was the old construct, which, by the way, still works, right? But you can also invest in the NFTs, and you can invest in the token infrastructure, which gives you governance and gives you votes. So put it slightly different in the context of games. Do you want to invest in Epic, or would you like to just own a piece of Fortnite? From a gamer standpoint, he may prefer to actually own a piece of his favorite game rather than necessarily owning a piece of the whole company, which does things that he or she may not be actually interested in, right? So that's one sort of aspect of this. So we actually think all games will move towards that kind of decentralized framework in the future. Now, for us as a role, you notice when we invest, we are typically sort of very open to bring other investors in. That's important for us because we think of it as an early form of sort of governance construction. So that means we have, sometimes 10, 20 investors. I remember back in the day, it was like, oh, don't bring too many investors.
Right.
Angel investors, they're just going to bug you and talk to you and just annoy you and stuff. And while that may be true for some investors, actually in the Web3 world, and with the capital, the way that it's being distributed, there's a lot of value add. And in fact, what happens is that those early investors, they become your counsel.
Yep.
You have 10, 20 guys who are really smart. You can draw on that. But remember, 20 years ago, it was like, don't take too much money from different people, just take money from one or two people, right? Which I think was a VC narrative, frankly speaking. So that means we're shared across. So even if we are big investors, we're never dominant, right? There are some investors who want to take the entire round or take everything over.
Yeah.
And that's their practice because they want to make sure they have the best outcome for themselves and not for others.
Yeah. It's like the old poker joke. If I get invited to a deal and I don't know what value they want from me, it's probably not a good deal.
Yes, correct. And also I think there's a little bit of a decorum as well. In a game of poker, if you win a big hand and you say, okay, thank you, bye-bye, right? Everyone in the table is like, what just happened? You just made a big hand and you just took everyone out and now you leave? What's the right thing to do? Actually, societally, well, I made some money, that's great, I keep playing. Because that's kind of what we expect, right? So the poker game is a great analogy because most VCs just, I made a big hand, and they just walk out and say bye-bye. And then they act surprised, like why people don't like them.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I saw this. What's it called again? It's called Chads and Flippers. There's an open list of Web3 funds, and you're pretty far near the top, right?
Yes,
that's pretty good.
Exactly. And I think that's important because that's reputation too. Because in the old VC construct, it was equity. And you were basically forced to be stuck for 3, 5, maybe longer years before you get an exit. But with the token construct, or with NFTs, for instance, actually investors can actually get liquidity fairly quickly. And then it's a question about actually how long-term are you, in fact. And there have been, of course, in the early days, people who just sold out too quickly. There's one thing, though. It's on-chain. And on-chain means that everything you've done, good and bad, will be there forever for someone to see.
Downturn in the economy and in tokens, does that change your strategy at all?
It doesn't change our strategy. What it does do is give us better deals. Right. I would argue that now is the best time to enter the space because many people didn't, understand what was going on. But, when we built in 2018, Bitcoin was like $3,000. Ethereum actually hit $80, when we were building in that time. If Bitcoin was worth $30,000 or $40,000 and if ETH was as high as it is even today, it would be much more expensive for us to enter the market. And the narrative has changed, right? 4 years ago, everyone's just running for the hills. And now everyone's just waiting to get in. Everyone's like, what's the right time? Ooh, the price is going lower. Have we hit bottom? But the recognition that Web3 is important is here. The recognition that blockchain is not going away is here. So the conversation has changed entirely. So I'm optimistic, for the mid to long term. Short term, obviously, if you're a trader, that's a different story, but that's not who we are. So it really doesn't affect us.
Right. No, I agree. I think that it also takes the completely speculative people out, which I think removes a class of
It brings back
issues.
the builders.
Yeah, it brings
and
back
actually
the builders.
It gives more power to the builders and the people who have a long-term view, precisely.
And also, I think it was for a lot of technical people, you made more money just doing an NFT drop and instead of building a company.
Or token sale.
I think that's a good thing. And then sort of in that context with Japan, so we've got some deregulation happening. You guys have entered the market. I don't know if you can or want to talk about what you're doing in Japan.
Yeah. We have a great ambition to be working with, Japanese culture and IP. Japan, if you think about it, actually, if you think about NFTs, right? We describe them as stores of culture. There are ways in which you transport that culture digitally, across, everyone in the world, especially in the digital context. Japan has all of these elements plus a very digitally native society. So we think NFTs are actually perfect. But there isn't quite a strong understanding of that here, right, for the time being. One of the challenges is that if you look at the West, for instance, that's where most of the innovation in NFTs are being driven. Bored Apes is ultimately, like an American company. Even Sandbox, although it's our company, it's not an Asian company per se. Its culture is very Western. But if you think about Asia as a country, it has an incredible sort of amount of culture to offer to the world. So we think that coming here, we have two missions. One of them obviously is to look at opportunities and to export Japanese culture but also to enhance the possibilities of everything that we've built and invested in Japan as well, because it is a place that I think will greatly benefit from that. Japan is, in relative terms, an incredible economic powerhouse, but it comes from the fact that it has great culture. People are attracted to Japan because of its traditions and its culture. So we think it's a great place for Web3. We were working with a lot of brands, and even in the early iterations of Animoca before it went to blockchain, we were making games for Doraemon and Astro Boy and Chibi Maruku-san, all these kind of brands we were working with at the time. So it's just a testament to the strength that Japanese IP has built over time.
But also that's sort of been your skill, right? I mean, I remember you would work with all these brands and think about their digital strategy. So that's sort of also what Japan needs, probably.
It actually helped us a little bit in the early days when we got many of these IP licenses. If you look at, for instance, what's happening with Sandbox, but also if you look at sort of our other IPs, we managed to get them in part because we had experience dealing with them. Also, they had comfort because at the end of the day, they had some trust already with us.
So we've got the downturn, we're building, we're doing Japan's. What's a 5 to 10 year vision, both for you and the metaverse? Where is it going?
Well, let's talk about the broad vision. As we said earlier, we think digital property rights is going to lay this entire foundation of an open internet, because now we have a piece of it, which forces large platforms to basically behave more fairly. Because if I can move my data and get value from somewhere else, then my competitive framework changes. So that's one important construct. The other thing is because the data that is valuable comes from us. We believe in this concept that we describe as universal basic equity, which is interesting, right? Because people talk about the future with machine and work and so on as universal basic income is the way we solve that. But that's a very hyper-socialist view of the world. And we've seen what that does in places where it demotivates people's purpose and their work. But equity is different because equity comes from your own source. So it's like saying, well, you and I may not necessarily make the same amount of value, and that's okay. But we have a friction of that, and that brings broader value in society. And that to me is important. But here, we are all builders of our own equity, right? Which changes that framework. Where in the past, we were dependent on others. In fact, you could say in the digital world, we're serfs of that. So where does Animoca Brands play? Well, by delivering digital property rights, we ensure that everyone has a piece of that. That's why it's so important for us to offer, both expensive but also cheap NFTs. We did, for instance, drops in our games where the NFT for Random Galaxies was given entirely for free for a community as a way to bring them and include them. And they had maybe, they were worth maybe $5, $10, but eventually led them to have, value in sort of planets in this case that generate, income inside the game. That's a way in which we sort of nation build and within our games. So that's the vision we have to keep growing that space. In 5 to 10 years, we think many of our games will be decentralized. We will be, substantial owners of them, but we will not control them. We think all of them will be DAOs, and the community will lead them. And our belief is that when there is a majority interest that serves a majority, and it has a kind of self-defense mechanism that everyone will ultimately do what's best for most of them, and it won't basically serve the interest of a minority, which ultimately leads to death, because you only serve the interest of a small group as opposed to large ones. And we see this today. Maybe a physical democracy can veer wrongly, but it somehow self-corrects itself because most people agree that this is bad. We don't see this in the digital world at all. In fact, if Facebook was owned by its users, probably many of the things that we criticize about it that we really dislike would not have happened either.
Interesting. Well, thanks for coming, and hopefully it's not another 15 years before you're back in Tokyo.
My pleasure, of course. Thank you.
Thanks, Yat. はい、皆さんいかがでしたか？今日のインタビューはYatSiuでした。今までのいろんなやってきた話と、これから Web3 と NFT のビジョンの話も聞けたので、本当にこれからの日本とこの業界を見ていく、考えていく中でAnimocaは本当にリーダーになると思いますので、これからフォローしていきたいと思います。